So MacDonald assumes that a sane human will always in the end desire joy. When at long last they find that the only way to have joy is to turn to God, well, they're going to turn to him. In short, he believes we will all be surprised by joy.
Welcome to The Plunge with Derek Holzer. I'm Derek. I'm so excited to have Jess Lederman joining me today. I want to apologize. I mispronounced his name during our interview, but it's Jess Lederman. I hope you enjoy our conversation on the Great Divorce. This is the final installment in our series on C.S. Lewis's work regarding the afterlife. Jess Lederman is the creator of the wonderful website, worksofmacdonald.com. He is an author of historical fiction, and his book, Heart Set Free, an epic tale of love, faith, and the glory of God's grace, is available online. To my estimation, he is the editor of the most accessible edition of George MacDonald's unspoken sermons that exists. It is a daily devotional reader, and its title is Consuming Fire, The Inexorable Power of God's Love. I'd encourage you to check it out. Thanks for joining us, and thank you, Jess, for being willing to take the plunge. Let's dive in. Well, I'm so thrilled to be speaking with you today, Jess. For many of you who are fans of George MacDonald, would know some of his work, and I have to say from the get-go, Jess, that your compilation of MacDonald's unspoken sermons in the Consuming Fire book has been nothing short of a godsend to me, my family, and extended family and friends. So I just want to start with a personal, deeply heartfelt thanks. I really cherish that work that you did, and I still read it most every morning. So really
Thank
grateful
you.
to you.
That's inspiring and wonderful to hear.
Yeah. In fact, I worked at a Bible college a few years back on the East Coast, and one of the graduating classes, I gifted them all a copy of that book. So I love what you've done, and I'd love to start our conversation. Of course, we're discussing The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis, in which George MacDonald plays a key figure and an important role. But I wanted to start back a little earlier in your own journey, and curious about how it came to be that you created that book, but also your website, worksofmacdonald.com, which is just loaded with great content.
Sure, yeah, and maybe the way to approach that is with the story of how I came to Christ. Because I spent the first 50 years of my life as a very self-satisfied atheist, maybe even a sort of an evangelical atheist. And then one day in 2005, came across, it was actually my late wife, listened to an interview with a man named Francis Collins on the radio. Yeah. Collins is the guy who, back in the early 2000s, was head of the government program to map the human genome. A huge breakthrough in science. And he wrote a book called The Language of God, which is about two things. One is the race to decode the genome, but the other was, and maybe even more compelling part of it, is his own personal journey from being an atheist to a devout evangelical Christian. And so here's a man who's both a very eminent scientist and evangelical Christian. And I'd been raised in a house of scientists, and I thought this was interesting. And so I decided I'd buy the book, The Language of God. And Collins, very humble guy, in talking about how he became a Christian, he gives a lot of credit to C.S. Lewis. And being a humble guy, he figured, rather than reinvent the wheel, he would quote from Lewis, who, after all, here's another fellow who went from atheism to belief. And so the book is filled with quotes from Lewis. And reading this, I'm thinking, this Lewis guy, sounds like he's pretty sharp. And thought, okay, did a little research. And he's written a lot of books. Okay, I bought not everything that Lewis had written, but probably 2/3 of it, and started reading that. Well, you don't get too far into C.S. Lewis before you discover the man who was his great inspiration, George MacDonald. And I thought, wow, okay, if Lewis was so inspired by MacDonald, maybe I ought to read him too. And in this case, turned out at that time, 2005, you could still buy the complete works of MacDonald in hardcover. You can't do it these days without a lot of effort. And all 50 volumes showed up in a
Wow.
blizzard of cardboard boxes, arrived at our house, and we unpacked it and started in on the rest is history. Sort of these two men kind of double teamed me. They became the midwives of my rebirth from above, you might say, with, in a way, kind of Lewis being the mind and MacDonald the heart. Not to say that Lewis didn't have a heart and MacDonald didn't have a strong intellect, but that's a bit of it. And actually that's something which we'll return to later on. So that's how I came to Christ, thanks to Lewis and MacDonald. Now, MacDonald is not nearly as well known as Lewis, right? And I think that there's a couple of reasons for that. One is he's writing in an earlier century, right? I mean, Lewis as a 20th century writer is very, very readable to modern readers. MacDonald is writing Victorian prose. Why say something in 10 words if you can say it in 30 or 40, right? So that's a challenge for some readers. But also, I think, and maybe even more important, is that Lewis kind of gets a pass from the very influential evangelical Christian community, right? I mean, you read Mere Christianity or anything else, and there's plenty of stuff that, logically give your basic Reformed Christian pause, but he pretty much gets a pass, and MacDonald does not. For the most part. And there's an infamous video, easy to find on it, and if you Google it, which is a short video with John Piper and Tim Keller. And I sort of probably blame Piper a little more on this one, but Keller went along with them. And they both sort of are agreeing and smirking a bit about how George MacDonald was not really a Christian, and therefore you can imagine where he probably is right now in the afterlife. And I think there were a couple of things that led to this. One is that there's in some circles, I suppose, infamous quote from MacDonald at the end of one of his great unspoken sermons, where he talks of turning with loathing from the portrait of God painted by Jonathan Edwards. Well, Jonathan Edwards is a patron saint. If there were patron saints in the evangelical community, Jonathan Edwards would be one of them. And so, saying that you turn with loathing from Jonathan Edwards' portrayal of God, think of sinners in the hands of an angry God, right? That kind of the antithesis of MacDonald's vision of who God is. But then also, of course, MacDonald's belief, or at least intense hope, for universal salvation. And that's anathema to many, or perhaps, the vast majority of Reformed Christians who, are very quick to say, that you can't understand the good news if you don't understand the bad news. The bad news is we all deserve to burn in hell. Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
So given this lack of, I felt a great gratitude to MacDonald as well as Lewis, and given the lack of awareness of MacDonald, that kind of inspired me to create the works of MacDonald.com, the works of George MacDonald, information about MacDonald, but also kind of encourage creativity and be a sort of an open forum to the George MacDonald community. So there's a lot of art and music inspired by MacDonald, commentaries on MacDonald. It's got a lot of stuff on it. And then the Consuming Fire devotional, there, Unspoken Sermons is certainly the place to go if you want to understand George MacDonald's theology. Well, it's 3 volumes written in often, intense Victorian prose, and it can be intimidating, to put it mildly, to many readers. Who's going to pick up a 3-volume work like that? But it's incredible. And so I thought how to make it more approachable. I didn't want to, some people have rewritten MacDonald's Victorian language. I didn't want to do that. But what I did is to take Unspoken Sermons and just cut out some of the what you could argue as excess verbiage, break it into 365 one-page pieces so that it could be read through as a daily devotional. But I think I was pretty successful in not losing anything significant from what's expressed in unspoken sermons. And yeah, it's certainly been, this was back in 2015, and it is, while we have published many different editions of MacDonald's works, over 20 of them, certainly the Consumer Fire Devotional has been probably the most popular, and I'm really delighted to hear what it's meant to you. So there you go. That's my journey.
Thank you, Jess. And I note as I look at the screen, there's a copy on the shelf behind me of that exact book. But can I ask one follow-up, because that's a significant undertaking, and MacDonald surely must have stirred you in a way that no other thinker, writer had, perhaps, to that point in your life. I mean, that's a lot of work, and I appreciate it, but I'm curious about the inspiration for that.
Well, the inspiration literally was meeting Christ through MacDonald. Lewis too, as I said. But when everything George MacDonald wrote, and most of what he wrote is fiction, right? It's you have many so-called children's works, although in fact, I read them in my 50s, and they're as much for adults as they are for kids. And his so-called realistic novels, and they are all, in a sense, sort of sermons that show us Christ, the characters that show us what it's like to imitate Christ, to try to live as he lived, to try to be obedient to him. And as we'll talk about in this discussion, obedience is MacDonald's a great theme. So he really brought Christ to life for me, brought me to him in a way that really was very complementary to how Lewis did that. Lewis more on the intellectual side, MacDonald more on sort of revealing the beating heart of God, the perfect fatherhood of God.
Oh, thanks. As we transition, and again, thank you, I can't say it enough, so I'll just stop before I keep saying it one more time. But again, very grateful and recommend that everyone check out worksofmacdonald.com. We're talking about a work of fiction, The Great Divorce, and it's a passion of mine to promote fiction that leads people to transcendent truth and insight. And as you pointed out, the work of Collins and other scientists can be very meaningful and inspiring as well. But I think there's something unique about story that lets our guard down. I believe it was Lewis talked about, that the watchful dragons relax when you're enchanted. And so my first question is whether or not you have a memory of reading a work of fiction that sort of captivated you and transcended everything around you and carried you off to its world, and tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm a pretty avid reader, and I'm a novelist myself, and a writer of historical fiction, and so I have a special fondness for historical fiction, and especially historical fiction that touches on, one way or another, with various Christian themes. I'll tell you the book that came to mind when you asked that question. And that is probably, possibly a little controversial one, but Lauren Groff, wonderful, incredible writer of literary fiction, lyrical literary fiction. Her book Matrix, published just a few years ago, and I'll tell you just a little bit about it. You may be grabbed by the very first three sentences. I'll just read them to you. She rides out of the forest alone, 17 years old, in the cold March drizzle. Marie, who comes from France. It is 1158, the year 1158, and the world bears the weariness of late Lent. So this is a book about an imagined character who is a real historical character, Marie de France. The only thing which we know historically about Marie de France is what she wrote about herself. My name is Marie and I come from France. That's it. But we have her works. And in her works, scholars have deduced, well, she was probably of noble birth, knew how to read and write, for one
Sure.
thing, that's a tip-off. And in her narrative poems and in her fables, she writes of strong, cunning women who defy conventional religious notions of love. They seduce men, they run circles around their dim-witted husbands, they get away with adulterous affairs. So, she says, okay, what might this, that she then spins this incredibly compelling fictional character with outsized, I'd say, Shakespearean strengths and weaknesses, who, to make a long story short, goes from being a sort of a desperate, despondent teenager who couldn't be further away from any notion, any sort of religious notions at all, to the a sort of a transcendent visionary leader, an abbess, a leader of an abbey, who she actually transforms a previously decrepit, impoverished abbey into a virtual utopia for women. Say, a strict Orthodox Christian is probably going to say, "Oh, this is some sort of crazy heretical tale," because it's sort of a radically feminist take on Christianity. Jesus is hardly mentioned at all. It's all about the Blessed Virgin, and you have lesbian nuns in this abbey, completely isolated from the male world. But even in this different dimension, this radical take on Christianity, she's dealing with themes that should be common to any Christian, about how do you overcome the self, how do you love selflessly. As Lewis pointed out, you can find yourself obeying Christ even if you've never heard of him, or even if you don't believe in him. Anyway, I can't recommend Matrix highly enough. It's a wonderfully compelling read, particularly for people who are into very lyrical fiction and historical fiction.
Love it. Well, I love that last sentence. The world bore the weariness of late Lent. That's beautiful. And we can all know what that feels like. Huh. Well, I have not heard of that one, so thank you for a new book to check out. I really appreciate it. So as we turn to The Great Divorce, when did you first read it, and what did you think when you first read it?
Well, this was probably, I'm not exactly sure, but it was probably somewhere in 2006 or 2008 when I was digesting all of Lewis and MacDonald. Again, I've read all of MacDonald. I've read probably 3/4 of C.S. Lewis. So somewhere in there, close to 20 years ago, and I was captivated by it. It was compelling to me. As I've reread it, I find I'm more critical of it than I was when I first read it. But I was immediately captured by. He weaves a spell that anyone is going to be immersed in, and I think captivated by, who's got any imagination at all.
Right. Yeah. So I'm asking everyone in this series a couple of the same questions, and that there are these two, and I'm interested to see what there are similarities and where there are differences. But is there a scene in The Great Divorce that fills you with sorrow? And if so, which one and why?
Sure. Well, it was interesting when I thought about the various scenes, because there's many scenes in which certainly where you feel, after almost every encounter, either between the bright spirits and the ghosts, except for one, either goes very badly or
Yeah.
it's not clear how it's going to go, and so there's a lot of things that could get you down. But if I had to pick the one that actually filled me with the most sorrow, in a way, it was at the very, very end of the book. It's where Lewis writes, "The morning," I cried, "I am caught by the morning, and I am a ghost." But it was too late. Light like solid blocks, intolerable of edge and weight, came thundering upon my head. Next moment, the folds of my teacher's garment were only the folds of the old ink-stained cloth on my study table, which I had pulled down with me as I fell from my chair. The blocks of light were only the books which I had pulled off with it. Falling about my head, I awoke in a cold room. hunched on the floor beside a black and empty grate, the clock striking 3 and the siren howling overhead. So what this had me thinking about is that what are the most devastating dreams? They're not the nightmares. Oh, you wake from a nightmare and you feel, oh, this is great. It was only a dream. They're the ones which, while you're dreaming, seem the best. And there's no sense that, I think from this scene, that Lewis wakes inspired by having glimpsed some transcendent truths. He wakes with a despair, I think, that it was only a dream and he's back in a world in which heaven and hell themselves might be only phantasms. Now, I doubt that was Lewis's intention, but, and of course the very existence of the Great Divorce tells us that Lewis obviously found considerable inspiration from this imagined dream. And nonetheless, just because I can identify with this awakening from where you wanted to be, Lewis, I have no doubt he's come a long way in his time with MacDonald in this dream, to be so close to where he might be able to accept what he needs to accept and experience the true dawn, and then to find himself back in the world that must have been grim. So that's actually the scene that filled me with the most sorrow. I'd be fascinated to know where, if you get, as you've asked that question, whether there's a particular scene that's sort of the winner on most sorrowful in The Great Divorce. I don't know if you've...
I will keep you updated, and so you're the 4th guest of 8, possibly 9, and no one has mentioned that yet. So they've all been different. I think one exception has been 2 people have talked about the mother with the son that she wouldn't let go.
Oh yeah, I'm not surprised.
Yeah, and that one is a perplexing one to me, and I think it's affected as well by our modern sensibilities about even the notion as it's portrayed there that God had to take her son. I think there's less acceptance of that kind of conception of what happens when someone dies as there once was, right? So anyway, I will certainly keep you abreast of the popularity of your choice.
And I assume I would guess I'm an outlier. I don't think anyone else will pick that one, but we'll see. We'll see.
Well, I appreciate it. I really like that idea that you shared, that most often it's comforting to awake from a nightmare, but in this case it was
right. I mean, that's the irony, and you have the famous quote from Hamlet, right? To sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams might come, right? But to me, it's the other way around.
Yeah, I tend to agree. You're persuasive. Now, on the flip side, is there a scene in The Great Divorce that gives you great hope? And if so, which one and why?
If I can cheat a little bit, I'll answer that 2 ways. There's one that I assume has to get most of the votes, right? The most obviously hopeful scene is the one where the ghost with the red lizard on his shoulder finally gives permission for the bright spirit to kill that thing, and then you have this magnificent transformation, not only, of course, of the ghost, but of the thing that was tormenting him. Lewis writes in several of his books about how we can pervert something that's should be good and end up worshiping it, and the lizard is presumably something like that, and it is transformed into this magnificent horse. So the correct thing that it should have been all along, right? So who isn't going to find that hopeful? I certainly found that very hopeful, because I think we all hope and pray that we will have the courage to do that, right? I mean, every one of us has some version of this thing where we just, tomorrow I'll do the hard thing, and then can we actually have the courage to do that hard thing now? So yeah, that is hopeful. But in some ways, the most hopeful of all to me was simply thinking the thought of meeting George MacDonald in the life to come. Not the MacDonald of Lewis's invention, I have to admit, but the real one. And that notion, that's pretty inspiring.
Yes, uh, I'm perplexed by this. As you had mentioned, Piper and Keller, that video, I've seen that, and I'm going to get to my point here. But my point is, in the context, particularly in the American evangelical community of which I grew up, in which Piper and Keller would be big figureheads, right, is the absence of really a tangible awareness of the great cloud of witnesses, which I think this story presents more explicitly than is ever mentioned or discussed in the context that I grew up in, which is in Kentucky in the Bible Belt. There's something about the supernatural, at least in that context, that's just taboo all the way around, even though there's plenty of scripture as well as, just lots of accounts of encountering people from the other side, as it were. And I'm curious about that because one of the comments that grieved me about that interview was they discussed whether or not they could be friends with George MacDonald. Not right, like it's one thing to judge whether or not he's a true Christian, but then to make the comment about whether or not they could be friends with him, that's such a us them posture. And I don't know if it extends to, the great cloud of witnesses or not, but we're certainly preoccupied with this domain here right in front of us.
If I recall correctly, they actually asked that about Lewis too, right?
Yes.
Would you really like Lewis? If you met him, I think a little suspicion of how intellectual Lewis was, I think was the vibe I kind of picked up on there. So they weren't entirely sure Lewis would be all that much fun, but yeah.
Well, if he wasn't, kicked out for drinking and smoking, but anyway, thank you for that. I do love that vision of meeting George MacDonald on the other side. So one of the reasons that I asked you to participate in this series, and I'm very grateful for it, is I've noticed your work, again, your compilation on the website, not just your own work, but the people that have participated and published pieces on worksofmacdonald.com, your own work in developing the illustrated edition of Lilith, and so many other things. I believe I've come across quite a few things that you've done, and your deep passion for proper representation, I think, of George MacDonald would be a fair characterization. And so I've invited you and a friend of yours, Karen Scheffler, onto this series to have a voice of people who have really immersed themselves in the work of MacDonald as you have, and to give your take on Lewis's portrayal of MacDonald. So I prepared a series of questions, but I'd love for you just to take it where you would like, and if I follow up with any questions, great, but just kind of give us your take on how Lewis portrayed MacDonald in this novel.
Okay. Let me start with where I think he gets MacDonald right. Certainly, Lewis knew MacDonald. You can see that in many ways, and I have near me the anthology that he put together, filled with 365 quotes from George MacDonald. And one of the things he does really well is he captures George MacDonald's Scotch toughness. Right? Like, I talk about how, wouldn't it be great to meet George MacDonald? But at the same time, I'm no fool. I know I would get my butt kicked. Okay? And there's nothing more convicting than reading George MacDonald. He famously said that God is easy to please, but very hard to satisfy. And, you can really see that in the quote that's presented at the very beginning of the Great Divorce. What quote is it? Is, "No, there is no escape. There is no heaven with a little of hell in it. No plan to retain this or that of the devil in our hearts or our pockets. Out Satan must go, every hair and feather." That's how he begins, and of course that theme is obvious throughout the Great Divorce. So. He's delighted that you'll get on the bus and come on up, but very hard to satisfy. You're going to have to. There is no. You can't keep a little bit of hell with you. As Lewis, he doesn't even let his book, the novel, speak for itself. He writes a preface, right, where he wants to make sure everybody understands what he's saying here, right? And then you've got the MacDonald quote on top of, just to hammer it in. And MacDonald, why is he so convicting? He reminds us of our hypocrisies, our tendency to make religion a matter of the intellect, or some sort of game, or some way that we can enhance our own reputations or our careers, or to make it something of mere belief rather than the one thing that counts: obedience
Obedience.
to Christ. Of course, what's the great saying of the Reformed Church, right? Is that we are saved through faith alone. And MacDonald might have said, okay, yes, I'm with you, but the one, and I don't have, I very frustrated. This quote should have been easy to find, but I couldn't find it, so I'm going to paraphrase it, where he said, the one great heresy of the church is that it takes anything other than obedience to Christ as faith. Right? What is faith? It is obedience to Christ. That's why, obviously, there's no contradiction between the writings of St. Paul and the writings of St. James. Faith without works is empty. Well, that's because faith itself it's a verb, not a noun, in a sense, right? It's active obedience to Christ. So Lewis's MacDonald is appropriately tough on Ghost Lewis, right? He reminds him. I love. Let me just quickly turn to page 73 here. And MacDonald, at one point, when Lewis is telling him about some other ghost that passed up on the joy of heaven, he says, "How fantastic!" said I. "Do you think so?" said the teacher with a piercing glance. "It is nearer to such as you than you think. There have been men before now who got so interested in proving the existence of God that they came to care nothing for God himself, as if the good Lord had nothing to do but exist. There have been some who were so occupied in spreading Christianity that they never gave a thought to Christ." So, I mean, it's so easy to see Lewis reading MacDonald must have many times, sitting in his study and congratulating himself on his latest opus and the praise that he's getting. Must many times have thought, am I a total fraud? He must have felt MacDonald kicking him in the butt, just like I do, and thought, maybe, should I be sweeping the floor instead of doing something useful, instead of writing about what's the true faith. So, and then some of the words that he puts in MacDonald's mouth really ring true to me. For example, very briefly, at one point he has MacDonald saying, hell is a state of mind? You never said a truer word. And every state of mind left to itself, every shutting up of the creature within the dungeon of its own mind is in the end hell. And we'll return to that. That's that's very, very true to MacDonald. The passage that I just read before about sort of the academic proofs of God as opposed to actually caring about God. And then when MacDonald is talking about the ghosts who are almost like monsters, who they come to this entrance into paradise only to spit and gibber out in one ecstasy of hatred, their envy, their contempt of joy. Lewis says, well, how do they come to be here at all? I asked my teacher. I have seen that kind converted, said he, when those ye would think less deeply damned have gone back. Those that hate goodness are sometimes nearer than those that know nothing at all about it and think they have it already. So that's the sort of great insight into human nature that MacDonald had as well, the kind of thing I think that MacDonald would have said. Those are things that, that rings true. But there's a lot where Lewis is really using MacDonald as a mouthpiece for his own idea, saying, okay, well, the master was deluded on a few matters, but I have no doubt that, by now in the third heaven, he's been set right. And so therefore, if I met him in the afterworld, he would basically say many of the things I've also said in my other books. So Lewis, he presents a MacDonald who in the afterlife renounces his passionate belief, or at least his intense hope, because MacDonald never called himself a universalist, but it's obvious from his writings that he had, at the very least, an intense hope that all will ultimately be saved. Now, so what are the arguments that Lewis marshals against this notion? Well, in chapter 13, he has Lewis reminding MacDonald that, hey, weren't you universalist? You talked as if all men would be saved. And so what's the response to that? And the argument basically, and I see this many places, is that universal salvation denies human freedom. And Lewis writes, he says, every attempt to see the shape of eternity except through the lens of time destroys your knowledge of freedom. Witness the doctrine of predestination, which shows, truly enough, that eternal reality is not waiting for a future in which to be real, but at the price of removing freedom, which is the deeper truth of the two. And wouldn't universalism do the same? Now, thinks a new way. So the idea is that if all are saved, then it must be that God somehow denies our freedom to reject him. Now, this is a flawed argument, and as philosophers like Thomas Talbot, who I'm a big fan of, have pointed out. Talbot, it's worth my just reading one brief passage from Talbot's great book, The Inescapable Love of God. Talbot, one of many contemporary philosophers and theologians who've been greatly inspired by MacDonald. So, what I'm getting at here is that he writes that a necessary condition of free choice is a minimal degree of rationality. Okay? So, what might qualify as a motive for someone making a fully informed decision to reject God? Once one has learned, perhaps through bitter experience, that evil is always destructive, always contrary to one's interest as well as to the interest of others, and once one sees clearly that God is the ultimate source of human happiness, rebellion can bring only greater and greater misery, then an intelligible motive for such rebellion no longer seems even possible. The strongest conceivable motive would seem to exist for uniting with God. So if a fully informed person should reject God nonetheless, then that person, like the boy in a story that he told earlier, who keeps repeatedly plunging his hand into a fire, would seem to display the kind of irrationality that's incompatible with free choice. So, and the real irony behind Lewis making this argument is Lewis's own story that he tells in Surprised by Joy. So, use in my historical research, like I mentioned, I write historical fiction. I use ChatGPT as my research assistant, which is a little bit like having a genius research assistant who also happens to have a bad sort of a habit of every once in a while sneaking into the back and smoking dope. And so, as long as you check on him and make sure that he. So I asked, I couldn't reach high enough on my bookshelf in time to pull down Surprised by Joy and find the passage, but I said, hey, find me that passage where Lewis talks about being checkmated by God. So here, let's see how good a job ChatGPT did. It's very brief. He says, the quote you're referring to from C.S. Lewis, Surprised by Joy, goes as follows. Amiable agnostics will talk cheerfully about man's search for God. To me, as I then was, they might as well have talked about the mouse's search for the cat. In this passage, Lewis vividly describes his feeling of being checkmated by God, emphasizing that it was not he who sought God, but rather that God pursued and cornered him. The imagery captures his realization that his resistance to faith was futile against the divine persistence. I think that's pretty good. And so the idea is that God is like the ultimate chess grandmaster. The ultimate chess grandmaster can take on 100 players be blindfolded, and he will beat every one of them. Now, does he have to deprive them of their free will in order to defeat them? Of course not. He's just going to outplay them, right? And
Right.
Lewis himself experienced this, right? And so, and yet didn't, yet still makes this argument that somehow universal salvation will insist on the denial of free will. Maybe he felt that maybe this was some ego about his own intellect, feeling like, oh, he could get there, but you're slobs like the big, what was it, the big man one of the first ghosts he meets, right? Guys like rubes like that, they're just not going to learn. Well, maybe, I don't know. When you think about this, so delving deeper into this is one of the big divides between Lewis and MacDonald, man's ultimate fate, nothing less than that, and the biggest problem with his representation of MacDonald in The Great Divorce. So if we back up a little bit, let's look at how do they both represent purgatory. And with Lewis, you've got this representation of purgatory as the gray town. Now, interestingly, his vision and MacDonald's vision of it are very, very similar. Okay, because of the gray town, you have this increasing separation between people, this increasing aloneness, of isolation of individuals in the gray town. Now, where MacDonald represented what we might call purgatory, his gray town, is in one of his greatest unspoken sermons, The Last Farthing. And in fact, interestingly, Lewis devotes probably about 10 pages of quotes in his anthology, a MacDonald anthology, to quotes from The Last Farthing. And let me just read a little bit of MacDonald's vision of what you might call, what Lewis calls the great town. He says, "I think I have seen from afar something of the final prison of all, the innermost cell of the debtor of the universe. It will endeavor to convey what I think it may be. It is the vast outside, the ghastly dark, beyond the gates of the city of which God is the light, where the evil dogs go ranging, silent as the dark, for there is no sound any more than sight. The time of signs is over. Every sense has its signs, and they were all misused. There is no man wakes from the final struggle of death, but an absolute loneliness, such a loneliness as in the most miserable moment of deserted childhood he never knew. Not a hint, not a shadow of anything outside his consciousness reaches him. All is dark, dark and dumb. No motion, not the breath of a wind, never a dream of change, not a scent from far-off field, nothing to suggest being or thing besides the man himself, no sign of God anywhere. God has so far withdrawn from the man that he is conscious only of that from which he has withdrawn. In the midst of the live world, he cared for nothing but himself. Now, in the dead world, he is in God's prison, his own separated self." So really a very similar starting point for what happens. The difference between the two men is in their understanding of what would then happen as a result of that isolation. So for MacDonald, he says, can there be any way out of the misery? Will the soul that could not believe in God, with all his lovely world around testifying him, believe when shut in the prison of its own lonely, weary all and nothing? It would for a time try to believe that it was indeed nothing, self-loathing, and that for no sin, from no repentance, from no vision of better, would begin and grow, and to what it might not come, no soul can tell. Of essential original misery, uncompromising self-disgust. Only then, if a being be capable of self-disgust, is there not some room for hope, as much as a pinch of earth in the cleft of a rock might yield for the growth of a pine? Nay, there must be hope while there is existence. For where there is existence, there must be God, and God is forever good, nor can be other than good. And so he imagines this 1,000 steps up from the darkness, each a little less dark, a little nearer the light. Repentance once begun grows more and more rapid if God once gets a willing hold. But with one finger he touched the man's self. Swift as possibility will he draw him from the darkness into the light. So that's MacDonald's view that we are rational beings.
Yes.
Because after all, if we're irrational, if we're crazy, well, craziness can be cured. Why wouldn't God cure craziness, right? And so ultimately, we don't want misery. And if God is the only way out, we will ultimately turn to Him, however long that takes. But Lewis clearly, yeah,
Sorry, that was that last passage. That's from The Last Farthing by
the last
MacDonald.
farthing,
Yeah,
correct. Yep.
please continue. Sorry.
So Lewis thinks, okay, look, people can make choices, and one choice leads to another, and eventually those choices can lead to the loss of their very humanity. They're no longer human beings. There's nothing left to save, right? And the grumbling woman, she's no longer a woman, she's a grumble. Okay, and okay, so much for you, grumbling old woman. Now you're only a grumble. And it's this is a strong argument, right? I'm not making fun of his argument and we see it all the time, right? It is absolute truth that people, one choice leads to another choice, and you become someone you probably never wanted to become. So that can happen. But the question is, how far do you take this? Because if Lewis is correct that we can actually lose our very humanity, then that's a serious design flaw in the way humans are constructed, right? After all, God tells us that the scripture tells us that God desires that none be lost and all be saved. Okay, would you therefore design humans so that one mistake leads to another mistake leads to another mistake, and then you have no way back at all? You've made too many mistakes, and that's it for you, and that's it for the God's for what had God desires. God loses
Yeah.
in that. As philosophers like Talbot pointed out in that passage I read, or he elaborates on, if we keep sticking our hand in the fire, that's insanity, right? We have I think a merciful justice in having an insanity defense. I don't think there's too many people who are opposed to that. And surely in the great courtroom on the last day, the insane are not going to be tossed into the fire. Insanity would be cured, right?
Right.
So MacDonald assumes that a sane human will always in the end desire joy. When at long last they find that the only way to have joy is to turn to God, well, they're going to turn to Him. In short, he believes we will all be surprised by joy. That's not just for a few elite Oxford professors.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. There's two thoughts that come to mind. First is the subtitle for your Consuming Fire devotional, The Inexorable Power of God's Love, right? Which is tied a little bit to that example of being checkmated, although I prefer not the cold calculating, geometric positioning of chess pieces, but the warm, inviting love of the true one Father, right? That's such a more compelling notion of what our experience is. But the other thing I've thought about quite a bit is I've read regarding Lewis and Tolkien and the Inklings generally, the serving in World War One, witnessing trench warfare, participating in just brutal evil, trying to rationalize or figure that out. I mean, no doubt they suffered from what we now call PTSD, and they worked in their novels, Tolkien explicitly, against any modern inventions and machinery that was used to subjugate others and destroy them. And I think, to Lewis's point, where he kind of latched on to personal freedom, it became a rallying cry for the post-World War II, Cold War era, right? This notion of freedom is the primary thing that we are about and we are going to protect. And I could see it being projected into our conceptions of God, right? Because those who are more powerful than us, we had witnessed in that span of time using it to brutally commit genocide across the earth and ravage the planet. So I guess that's a little bit of my contextualizing why Lewis held on to that to the bitter end. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think that makes a lot of sense. This reaction against anything that smacks of totalitarian. Yeah, that's right. MacDonald has a quote where he talks about true freedom consists in being able to do the right thing even when everything in you wants to do the wrong thing. He says, then you have freedom. That's freedom. Everything else is, I can't remember, sometimes I can't remember if a quote comes from, or a particular image comes from Lewis or MacDonald, right? But I think it was MacDonald, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was MacDonald who talks about, what some people think of as the freedom to do what they want is really them obeying whatever demon happens to be whispering some nasty idea into their ear. And they think, that's freedom. That I can do what I want. No, that's actually slavery to evil. Freedom is when you can do what's right, even when everything in you wants to do what's wrong. And you can kind of see that in that hopeful passage, right, where the man with the lizard finally says, "Damn it, okay,
Yeah.
kill him."
Yeah.
There's also another argument that Lewis takes issue with. I would call it sort of the Robert Falconer argument. Robert Falconer being one of MacDonald's great books. And there's a passage, if I can quickly turn to page 135 in The Great Divorce, where Lewis says to MacDonald, what some people say on earth is that the final loss of one soul gives the lie to all the joy of those who are saved. And MacDonald says, you see it does not. And
I have that underlined in my copy with a bunch of question marks.
Yeah. So, I mean, the idea here that he sort of, what he's alluding to is in Robert Falconer, he famously, Falconer as a young child, burst into tears at the very notion that there would be people who are condemned forever to hell. And Lewis is basically saying, this is sort of soft-hearted nonsense. You're letting how does he put it, the demands of the loveless and the self-imprisoned, that they should be allowed to blackmail the universe, that till they consent to be happy on their own terms, no one else will taste joy. But really, MacDonald was reacting against a harsh Scottish Calvinism that was saying, if you don't become a Reformed Christian before you croak, you are going to burn forever in hell. And there's plenty today who there's a radio broadcast where I remember where some guy wanders the streets evangelizing, and he'll going up to young 16-year-old Catholic girls and saying, your eternal fate's on the line if you keep up with this whole Roman Catholic thing. You're going to be burning in hell. And it's not just the pagans and cannibals and darkest wherever. It's you too, girl. And he's reacting against that sort of nonsense. If Robert Falconer had been told, no, wait a minute, if he would not have said, wait, if someone's given a choice and decides to stay in hell, I'm forever going to be miserable. No, so it's sort of a false argument. He's arguing against a position that MacDonald never actually took. And then the thing which I'll sort of close with is, as I reread the book for probably the fourth time, preparing for this, there's really kind of a huge flaw in the approach which Lewis has heaven taking to rescue the ghosts. All right. First, the most minor part of that flaw is so many of these bright spirits manage to precisely figure out how to trigger the worst possible reaction in the ghosts, right? It's like, go to the big man and send the murderer who used to work for him to go to him. Yeah, that's a good strategy. That'll be, that's going to trigger him to say, to hell with you, I'm going back to hell. Or the painter. Yeah, tell him about how no one looks at his paintings anymore and see what kind of mood that'll put him in. Okay, so it's just kind of dumb, right? But that's sort of the least important. More important is that, and this I think goes to my own experience with, Lewis and MacDonald sort of grossly simplifying the intellect and the heart. Time after time, the bright spirits are making purely intellectual arguments, right? The woman who smothers her son with her selfish perversion of love is told that she must, quote, learn to love God for his own sake. Well, that's what I've been doing wrong. Okay, love God
To
for His own
learn.
sake. Got it, got it. Or the angelic Sarah Smith. She tells her tragedian husband he must stop using other people's pity the wrong way. That's what I've been doing wrong. Okay, okay, I got you. So the funny thing is, writers learn and Lewis learned this early on. Writers, what's one of the most famous things writers learn at the very beginning? Show, don't tell,
Tell.
right? So in almost every case, the bright spirits are telling, they are not showing. Think about one of the most effective conversion stories of all time. Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Jacob Marley does not go to Scrooge. Scrooge, old guy, here's the thing you've been doing wrong. You just, think about Jesus. And okay, no. He frightens the crap out of him with the goat, and winds up with the coup de grace, is the ghost of Christmas future, and
Yeah.
you have a changed man. Well, okay, but you know what? The great exception to all this, where you have actual showing, not telling, is George MacDonald being the guide to Lewis, right? He's showing Lewis all these things, and bringing Lewis along. Lewis learns by being shown. So it's kind of it's just sort of a flaw in the setup, but you know ultimately what makes the book so wonderful, and despite the things I object to, I reading it the fourth time, I still loved reading it, and I'm sure I'll read it more times, precisely because MacDonald is showing Lewis what truth is, not just telling him about it. And that's what I think that's the most powerful part of the book, and the most enduring part of it. So for all its flaws, I love it.
Good. That's beautiful. Well, I appreciate so much your time. I wondered if you'd take a few more minutes and just tell us about your own writing.
Okay, well, as I said, I write historical fiction that takes place sort of anywhere from late 19th century into the middle of the 20th century. The novel that people can find on Amazon easily enough is called Hearts Set Free. Very, and just by anyone who reads it, who's familiar with MacDonald and Lewis, will see the influence of. I like to write about all the different ways in which people come to Christ, or find Christ, and perceive God. Aside from my obvious belief in universal salvation, which predictably sort of ticked off some evangelical readers, it's a pretty, its beliefs are pretty mainstream. I finished last year a second novel, which my agent is currently marketing, which will be a little more controversial. Heart Set Free has won a couple of awards, has been pretty successful, and I think speaks to a lot of people about the journey to belief, and the different ways that the different paths someone can take to get there.
And is it are they published under your name?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, I
Yeah.
Jess Lederman, right, as
Yeah.
author.
Sorry, I mispronounced your last name earlier. So just Letterman, not
My
Lederman.
if my parents had had spelled the last name Letterman, it would have saved a lot of grief. But yeah, Jess Lederman, Hearts Set Free, available in Audible or paperback or hardcover or Kindle, whatever.
Wonderful. Well, I appreciate it, and I hope everyone checks it out. And I think that's everything I've got for you today. I really do appreciate your time and sharing with everyone some perspectives on MacDonald and Lewis in The Great Divorce.
Thanks for the opportunity, Derek. I enjoyed it.
Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by the word astound. 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 It means to shock or greatly surprise, to fill with bewilderment or wonder. I love being astounded, don't you? Just being overwhelmed with astonishment or amazement at a new discovery, a revelation, an insight, or just a flat out surprise. You know, the word astound is Middle English and it comes from the word astound. That doesn't help us much, does it? So we're not going to really spend much time on the derivation or etymology. For those of you who are philologists, just send an email in and we'll talk about it. But I'm grateful to the word astound because my hope is that everyone experiences a little more astonishment in this world. And I mean good astonishment, not outrage or anger or frustration, but something breathtaking, something wonderful. And I think if you're not experiencing astounding things, it might be a couple of reasons for that. Either you stopped kind of looking for it, you know, or you see it, but you've grown familiar with things that you just take for granted. I know I do, but they're just miraculous as they were the first time you saw them, like an incredible sunset or a beautiful snowfall. In fact, there's snow falling in the deep south, apparently. Those of you in the Gulf states are experiencing white snow on white sandy beaches, a very rare occurrence. And I hope it astounds you. I bet it does. It's astounding me as I see pictures as I see pictures popping up from folks down in Mississippi and New Orleans with snowfall of all places. The world is full of astounding spectacles. Look for them, savor them, be astounded. Thank you, Astound, for sponsoring today's episode of The Plunge.